My son had me declared no longer capable of independent living on a Tuesday and moved into my house by Friday. I didn't fight him in court. I just smiled, packed one suitcase, and let him drive me to Magnolia Pines, the nicest nursing home in Savannah. He made sure to tell the relatives, like the thread count on the sheets was supposed to make up for what he was actually doing. What Preston didn't know was that 3 weeks before that hearing, I'd already made a decision. A quiet one, a legal one. The kind of decision that doesn't show up anywhere until it's too late to undo. He thought he'd just locked his mother away and inherited everything that came with her. He had no idea what he'd actually just lost. If you've ever been written off by your own family while you were still standing right in front of them, I think you're going to feel this one. So stick around till the end. Hit subscribe if this is your first time here, and tell me down in the comments, at what point would you have stopped forgiving? My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 74 years old, and for most of my life, I was the most underestimated person in every room I ever walked into. I met Robert Whitfield in 1971 at a church social in Savannah when I was 19 and he was 23, and already talking about a lumber yard he wanted to open one day. He didn't have a dime to his name back then, just a truck that backfired every time he started it, and a way of talking about the future that made you believe he could see something the rest of us couldn't. We married a year later. We didn't have a wedding so much as a gathering. My mother's church basement, a borrowed dress, a cake my aunt made that leaned slightly to one side. I didn't care. I'd have married that man in a parking lot if that's what it took. Robert opened Whitfield Building Supply 2 years after that, with a loan from his uncle and a single warehouse on the edge of town that smelled permanently of fresh-cut pine. I worked the front counter in the early years, did the books at our kitchen table every night after closing, learned how to read a balance sheet the same way some women learn to read a recipe. Out of necessity, then out of love for it. People assumed, because Robert's name was on the building, and Robert's voice was the one customers heard, that the business was his alone. I let them assume that. It never bothered me the way you might think it should have. I understood something early on that took most people years to learn. The person whose name is on the door isn't always the person actually running the place. By the time our son Preston was born in 1980, Whitfield Building Supply had grown from one warehouse to 4 locations across coastal Georgia. By the time Preston started kindergarten, we'd expanded into South Carolina. I was the one who negotiated supplier contracts. I was the one who decided which locations to open and which to close. I was the one who sat up at night during the '08 housing crash, doing math by lamplight, finding the path that kept all 400 of our employees on payroll when half our competitors were shutting their doors. Robert trusted my instincts completely. He used to say, only half joking, that the company had 2 engines, and his was just the one with his name painted on the side. I never minded being the quiet one. I want to be honest about that, because I think people hear a story like mine and assume there must have been some deep resentment underneath it all, some old wound about not getting credit. There wasn't. I liked the work itself more than I ever liked being seen doing it. There's a particular kind of peace in being the person who actually makes things run, instead of the person who has to perform running them. Robert died in 2009 of a stroke, sitting in his recliner on a Sunday afternoon with a baseball game on the television he never got to finish watching. I was 61 years old, and overnight, every board member, every supplier, every banker who'd dealt with us for 30 years turned to look at me, waiting to see if the quiet wife behind the books could actually hold the whole thing together without him. I held it together for 14 more years. I grew the company by 60% in that time. I opened 11 new locations. I turned down 2 buyout offers from national chains that would have made me richer faster, and left 400 of my employees scrambling to find new jobs within a year, because Robert and I had built that company on the belief that you took care of the people who took care of you, and I wasn't about to abandon that belief just because he wasn't there to remind me of it anymore. By the time I finally stepped back from day-to-day operations, at 72, Whitfield Building Supply was worth more than $100 million, and almost nobody outside the company truly understood that the woman who'd built most of that value, especially in the years after Robert died, was the same soft-spoken widow who still brought homemade banana bread to every company picnic and remembered the names of every employee's children. My son Preston understood it least of all, and that, more than anything else that happened later, is where this story actually begins. Preston was not a bad child. I want to say that clearly before I say anything else, because everything that came after makes it tempting to rewrite him backward into a villain from the very beginning, and that wouldn't be honest. He was a sweet boy, actually, for most of his childhood. He cried when he stepped on bugs by accident. He saved part of his allowance every week to buy his grandmother flowers on her birthday, without anyone telling him to. There's a version of Preston that still lives somewhere in my memory. 8 years old, sitting on the warehouse floor after closing time, helping me sort inventory by stacking boxes into towers. So proud of his crooked little towers that I never had the heart to tell him he'd mixed up half the SKU numbers. But Robert and I made a mistake with him, and I think I understood it even while we were making it, the way you sometimes understand a mistake in real time and still can't quite stop yourself from making it anyway. We gave him everything before he ever had to earn anything. It started small. A car at 16, brand new, because Robert wanted his son to have what he himself never had at that age. A credit card at 18, for emergencies, that somehow always seemed to cover concert tickets and clothes he didn't need. A diploma from a private university that cost more than our first warehouse. For a business degree he treated more like a formality than an education. When Preston graduated, Robert brought him into the company as vice president of operations. 22 years old, no prior work experience beyond 2 summers of barely supervised internships, and suddenly he had a corner office and a title that made him sound, on paper, like the second most powerful person in a $100 million company. I remember asking Robert, gently, whether that was wise. Shouldn't he start somewhere smaller? I asked. Learn the warehouse floor first, the way you did? He's my son, Robert said, like that settled it. He'll grow into it. He never grew into it. That's the part that still sits heavy in my chest, even now. Preston kept his office, kept his title, kept showing up to quarterly board meetings in suits that cost more than some of our employees made in a month. But the actual work of running Whitfield Building Supply kept happening somewhere he wasn't. In conversations with suppliers he never had, in late nights doing payroll math he never once offered to help with. I covered for him constantly, in ways I'm not proud of now. When a major supplier complained that Preston had missed 3 consecutive calls about a contract renewal, I called the supplier myself and smoothed it over before Robert ever heard about it. When Preston's operational restructuring plan, a glossy slideshow he'd clearly paid a consultant to build for him, would have cut costs by laying off 40 warehouse workers, I quietly killed the plan in a private conversation with Robert, framing it as my own concern rather than a rejection of our son's judgment, because I didn't want Robert to see what I was starting to see. Preston met Caroline when he was 26 at a charity gala for the Children's Hospital that Whitfield Building Supply sponsored every year. She was beautiful and sharp in a particular way. Sharp about appearances, about who mattered in a room and who didn't, about which fork to use and which words to drop into conversation, to make sure everyone understood exactly how much the Whitfield name was worth. I liked her at first. I want to be honest about that too. She was attentive to me in those early years, asked good questions, complimented my garden, sat with me at family dinners, and seemed genuinely curious about the early days of the company. It took me longer than it should have to understand that her curiosity wasn't really about me. It was about the company, about what it was worth and who would eventually control it, and how soon that transfer might happen. I remember the exact dinner where I first felt the floor shift slightly under that assumption. Preston and Caroline had been married 3 years by then. We were sitting at my dining table, the same table Robert and I had eaten every Sunday dinner at for almost 40 years, and Caroline asked, casually over dessert, "Eleanor, have you given any thought to succession planning? At your age, it really should be settled for everyone's peace of mind." "At my age," I repeated, mostly to myself. "I just mean, practically," she said, smiling in the careful, pleasant way she always smiled when she was steering a conversation somewhere specific. Preston's been with the company over 15 years now. It would put a lot of people's minds at ease to know things are formally in place. I looked across the table at my son, waiting to see if he'd say anything at all, in either direction. He just looked down at his plate and let his wife keep talking. That was the night I understood, with a kind of quiet clarity that didn't even feel like sadness yet, that my son had spent 15 years standing next to the family business without ever once truly stepping into it, and that the people closest to him were already, carefully, calculating how much longer they'd have to wait before that stopped mattering. The questions about succession planning didn't stop after that dinner. They just got more specific and more frequent. Over the next 2 years, Preston and Caroline developed a particular rhythm whenever the topic came up. Caroline would raise it, lightly, almost playfully, and Preston would follow a beat behind her, agreeing in a tone that always sounded slightly rehearsed, like he'd practiced his lines in the car on the way over. "Mom, you've earned the right to relax," he told me once at a 4th of July barbecue, while Caroline nodded along behind him. "Nobody would think less of you for stepping back fully. Let me take the wheel." Isn't that what Dad would have wanted? For the company to stay in the family, run by family? I remember thinking, even then, how strange it was that he framed it as staying in the family. As if I myself, the person who'd built 60% of the company's current value after his father died, wasn't already family enough to be trusted with it. I told him, gently each time, that I wasn't ready, that I still came into the main office 2 mornings a week, still reviewed the major contracts, still had relationships with suppliers that had taken 30 years to build, and couldn't simply be handed off like a set of keys. He'd nod, seem to accept it, and then the question would resurface a few months later in some new form, dressed up a little differently each time. The first real sign that something darker was forming happened almost by accident on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I'd come home from the office to find my house. My own house, the one Robert and I had lived in for 41 years, strangely rearranged. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. A stack of mail that had been on my kitchen counter was now sitting, slightly out of order, on the table in my study. A folder of financial documents I kept in a specific drawer in my desk, always in the same place, was sitting half an inch to the left of where I'd left it. I asked my housekeeper, Marisol, if she'd moved anything. She said no, but mentioned, almost in passing, that Preston had stopped by that afternoon while I was at the office. Let himself in with his old key, she said, and spent almost an hour in my study before she'd even realized he was there. I didn't say anything to Preston about it directly. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a son letting himself into his mother's house wasn't on its own a crime against anyone. But 3 weeks later, I got a call from my longtime physician, Dr. Halloran, a man who'd treated me for over 20 years. He sounded uncomfortable in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know I didn't agree to it. Your son called my office last week. He asked whether I'd be willing to write a letter for legal purposes regarding your cognitive state. He used the phrase, declining capacity. I sat down slowly in my kitchen chair, the same chair I'd sat in the morning after Robert's funeral, staring at nothing. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him," Dr. Halloran said carefully, "that you are, by every clinical measure I have, one of the sharpest 74-year-olds I have ever treated. I told him I wouldn't be writing any such letter." But Eleanor, I think you should know he didn't take that answer particularly well. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, doing something I rarely allowed myself to do anymore. I let myself cry, fully, the way you cry when you finally understand that a fear you'd been quietly carrying for months has just been confirmed as real. I called my attorney the next morning. Not the family attorney Preston used for the company. A different one entirely. A sharp, careful woman named Patricia Ford, who'd handled my personal affairs separately from Whitfield Building Supply for almost a decade. I told her everything. The rearranged study. The call from Dr. Halloran. The years of carefully worded conversations about succession that I now understood with sickening clarity had never really been about succession at all. "Eleanor," Patricia said, "after listening to all of it without interrupting once, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your son may be building a legal case against your competency. I've seen it before. It usually starts exactly like this. What do I do?" I asked her, and I remember how strange those words felt in my mouth. Me, a woman who had run a $100 million company through a recession without flinching, asking someone else what to do. "For now," she said, "you do nothing. You stay calm, you stay exactly as sharp and capable as you've always been, and you let me start quietly preparing some things on our end. If he's building a case, Eleanor, you're going to need one too." I didn't know yet, hanging up that phone, exactly what kind of case Patricia meant. I had no idea how much that quiet preparation would eventually come to matter, or how soon I'd need every bit of it. The petition arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a process server who waited politely on my porch while I signed for it, as if it were nothing more than a package from the holidays. In the matter of the guardianship of Eleanor R. Whitfield. Preston had filed for emergency guardianship, citing concerning patterns of cognitive decline and vulnerability to financial exploitation. I read through 14 pages of legal language describing a woman I didn't recognize. Someone who allegedly forgot to pay bills she'd never once forgotten in 50 years of paying them. Someone who supposedly repeated stories at dinner. Someone whose judgment regarding company assets had become, in the petition's words, increasingly erratic. Patricia came to my house within the hour. She read through the petition twice, her jaw tightening a little more with each page. "This is thin, Eleanor," she said. "Thin and ugly, but thin. The evidence here is mostly secondhand, a housekeeper's comment taken out of context, a single missed dinner reservation blown up into a symptom. He's hoping the judge moves fast and doesn't look too closely. Will it work?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "Not if you fight it properly. But Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer. Do you want to fight it properly? Publicly? Because that means a courtroom, testimony, possibly your son's own children, watching their grandmother be cross-examined about her mental fitness on the record. That's not a small thing to put yourself through." I sat with that question longer than I expected to. I thought about the version of myself I could be in that courtroom. Sharp, exact, demolishing every flimsy claim in that petition, point by point, in front of God and the judge and my own son, until Preston had no choice but to watch his case collapse in humiliating detail. And then I thought about something else entirely. I thought about what it would mean to win that fight loudly, and what would still be left standing afterward. A son publicly defeated, a relationship with my grandchildren, who I loved fiercely and who were old enough now to understand exactly what a courtroom spectacle like that would mean about their father. A victory that would feel, I suspected, less like justice and more like scorched earth. "I don't want to fight it loudly," I told Patricia finally. "I want to let it happen quietly. I want him to think he's won completely. And I want you to help me make sure that what he thinks he's won isn't actually what he's getting." Patricia studied me for a moment, and something that might have been respect moved across her face. "Tell me what you're thinking." So I told her. The hearing itself was almost unbearably anticlimactic, which I think surprised everyone in the room except me. I sat quietly at the defense table in a soft blue cardigan Caroline had once complimented me on, hands folded, answering every question the judge asked in a calm, measured voice. Yes, I understood the nature of the proceeding. Yes, I understood my son's concerns. No, I did not wish to contest a voluntary transition into supported living, given my age and my desire for a simpler life. I watched Preston's face the entire time. He looked, for most of the hearing, like a man bracing for a fight that never came, and somewhere underneath the relief, I could see crossing his features as my non-resistance became clear. There was something else, too. A flicker of confusion, as if some small, buried part of him had expected his mother to put up more of a fight, and was unsettled, even amid his victory, that she hadn't. The judge granted what amounted to a soft guardianship arrangement. Full financial oversight handed to Preston, with my voluntary cooperation noted clearly on the record, and a recommendation that I transition into a supported living environment appropriate to my needs. Caroline didn't even try to hide her satisfaction in the hallway afterward. "This is really for the best, Eleanor," she said, squeezing my arm in a gesture that managed to feel both gentle and faintly triumphant at once. "You'll be so well taken care of. Magnolia Pines has wonderful reviews." "I'm sure it does," I said, and smiled at her the exact way I used to smile at suppliers who thought they'd just talked me into a worse deal than the one I'd actually engineered. Preston drove me home that afternoon to pack. He was quieter than I expected, fidgeting slightly with the steering wheel at red lights, and somewhere around the third stoplight, he finally said, without looking at me, "This isn't because I don't love you, Mom. I just think, with the company, with everything Dad built, things need to be handled by someone who can really focus on it full-time now." I looked out the window at the live oaks lining the street I'd lived on for over 4 decades, and I thought about 15 years of quietly covering for him, of killing his bad ideas in private so his father never had to see them, of building 60% of a company's current value with my own 2 hands while he collected a title he'd never once earned. "I understand completely," I told him, and I meant something entirely different by those words than the thing he assumed I meant. I packed 1 suitcase that evening. Not because that was all I owned, because I'd already decided, 3 weeks before that hearing even began, exactly how little of what I owned I actually wanted with me anymore. Magnolia Pines looked exactly the way Preston had described it. Clean, well-lit, expensive in the careful, understated way that's meant to reassure adult children more than the actual residents living there. Fresh flowers in the lobby, a grand piano nobody played, a dining room with linen napkins and a view of a manicured courtyard where, I would learn over the following weeks, almost nobody actually sat. My room was lovely by any objective measure. A private suite, larger than most assisted living rooms, with my own small sitting area and a window overlooking the garden. Caroline had personally selected the room, I later learned, and made sure to mention its square footage to my sister-in-law at the next family gathering, as though the size of the room were itself a form of love. What none of them understood, what I'm not sure they ever once stopped to consider, was that a beautifully appointed room means very little to a person who built and ran a company for 50 years, when nobody inside that room ever asks her opinion about anything again. That was the part that hollowed me out fastest. Not the room. The way people began speaking about me instead of to me the moment I crossed that threshold. The staff meant well, mostly. But there's a particular tone people adopt around the elderly in places like that. A slightly raised pitch, a slower cadence, a tendency to phrase everything as a question even when it isn't one. "We're just going to take your blood pressure now, okay, Eleanor?" That's good. That's so good. I'd built and dismantled supplier contracts worth tens of millions of dollars, and now I was being praised, gently, for successfully holding still while someone wrapped a cuff around my arm. Preston visited twice in the first month. Both visits lasted under 30 minutes. Both times, he spent at least half of that 30 minutes on his phone, glancing up periodically to ask if I was settling in okay, in the same tone the staff used, like settling in was the only meaningful question left to ask me about my life. Caroline visited once, with my 2 grandchildren, Wesley and Abigail, who were 12 and 9. I lit up the moment I saw them. Genuinely, completely, the first real warmth I'd felt since arriving, and for about 20 minutes, sitting in the courtyard with Abigail showing me drawings from her sketchbook, and Wesley telling me, with great seriousness, about a science project involving volcanoes, I forgot entirely where I was. Then Caroline glanced at her watch, said something about traffic and an evening engagement, and the children were gone again. And I sat alone in that courtyard for a long time afterward, watching the place where they'd been sitting. It was on my 9th day at Magnolia Pines, on an evening when the loneliness had settled into something almost physical, sitting heavy in my chest like a held breath I couldn't release, that I rang the call button beside my bed for the first time. Not for any real medical need, just because I needed, desperately, for one single person to walk through that door and look at me like I was still someone worth looking at. The woman who answered was younger than most of the staff, with kind, tired eyes and a name tag that read Denise C. RN. "Hey there, Mrs. Whitfield," she said, coming in without any of that careful, sing-song caution the others used. "What's going on tonight?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly," I admitted. "I think I just wanted someone to talk to." I expected her to glance at her watch, the way Caroline had. I expected the polite excuse, the gentle retreat back into the hallway, and whatever clipboard duties were waiting for her there. Instead, Denise pulled the room's single armchair a little closer to my bed, sat down, and said, "Well, I've got about 20 minutes before my next round. Tell me something interesting about yourself, Mrs. Whitfield, and don't give me the boring version. I can already tell you've got better stories than that." I looked at her for a long moment. This stranger in pale blue scrubs who had no idea she was sitting across from a woman who had once negotiated a building supply contract worth $11 million over a single phone call, who had quietly kept a $100 million company afloat through a recession, while everyone credited her dead husband for it. "Well," I said, and for the first time in 9 days, I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly. "Where would you like me to start?" I told her about the lumber yard, about Robert's truck that backfired, about the supplier contracts and the recession and the nights doing math by lamplight. I don't know exactly when I started talking about Preston, but at some point I did. Carefully, at first, then less carefully. The way you talk when you finally find someone who seems to actually be listening, instead of waiting for her turn to leave. Denise didn't say much. She mostly just listened, occasionally asking a question sharp enough to prove she'd actually been following along, not the polite, hollow questions I'd grown used to from everyone else. "Can I ask you something?" she said, near the end of our 20 minutes, glancing at the clock. "Does your son know all this? About what you actually did for that company?" Because the way the file reads, Mrs. Whitfield, it makes it sound like you're just somebody's widow. I looked at her for a long moment, and something in my chest both ached and steadied at once. No, I said quietly. I don't think he ever really did. I want to take you back 3 weeks, before the hearing, but before Magnolia Pines, to the afternoon I actually made the decision that would change everything. It was the day after Dr. Halloran called me about Preston's request for a competency letter. I sat in my study. The same study Preston had quietly searched through weeks earlier, and I made a decision that surprised even me with how calm and clear it felt once I finally let myself arrive at it. I called Patricia Ford and asked her to draw up an entirely new will. Entirely new? She asked. Eleanor, your current will is straightforward. Everything to Preston, with provisions for Wesley and Abigail's education trusts. What exactly are you wanting to change? All of it, I said. I want you to draft something completely different, and I need you to do it quietly, Patricia. I don't want this filed anywhere Preston's attorney could stumble across it during whatever he's planning next. I didn't decide, in that moment, exactly who the new will would name. I knew only what I no longer wanted it to say. I no longer wanted everything I'd built, the 60% of company value I'd grown with my own hands after Robert died, the careful decisions that had kept 400 families employed through a recession to land entirely in the hands of a son who had spent 15 years standing beside that company without ever once truly working inside it, and who was now trying to have his own mother declared incompetent rather than simply wait for what he assumed was already coming to him. I sat with that decision for several days before I knew, with certainty, what I actually wanted the new will to say. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, about a week into my stay at Magnolia Pines, sitting with Denise during one of the 20-minute windows she'd started carving out of her rounds most nights, when something crystallized for me completely. We weren't even talking about anything serious that evening. She was telling me about her own life. Finally, after several nights of me doing most of the talking, she told me she was 38, divorced, raising a 12-year-old daughter named Maya on a nurse's salary that barely covered rent in a town where rent kept climbing faster than wages did. She told me, almost embarrassed, that she'd had to pick up a second per diem shift most weekends just to keep Maya in the gymnastics program she loved, because Denise refused to be the reason her daughter had to give up something she was good at. I'm not telling you that for sympathy, she added quickly, catching herself. I don't know. You actually ask about my life. Most people in here don't. Why wouldn't I ask? I said. You're the only person who's treated me like I still have a mind worth talking to since I arrived. She laughed a little sadly. That's a low bar, Mrs. Whitfield. It shouldn't be, I said, but it is. And I notice who clears it. I didn't say anything more to her that night about what I was planning. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. Denise had no idea, not the faintest suspicion, of what was forming in my mind as I watched her describe pulling double shifts so her daughter could keep doing gymnastics. She wasn't performing kindness for me. She had absolutely nothing to gain from any of it, as far as she knew. That, more than anything else, was exactly the point. I called Patricia the next morning. I know what I want the will to say now, I told her. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Tell me. So I told her, in full, exactly what I wanted. The company, the properties, the entirety of what would eventually total just over $100 million, redirected completely away from the family that had spent the last several years quietly working to push me out of my own life. Patricia didn't argue with me. She'd seen too much in her career, I think, to be shocked by something like this. But she did ask one careful question before she agreed to draft it. Are you doing this out of anger, Eleanor? Because anger makes for bad legal documents. I need to know this is something you actually want, not something you're doing to punish him. I thought about that question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. I'm not angry anymore, I told her, and I realized, saying it out loud, that it was true. I think I was angry for about a week. Now I just understand something clearly that I think I'd been avoiding understanding for years. I built something extraordinary, Patricia. And the people closest to me only ever valued it for what it could give them, not for what it actually meant, or what it took to build it, or what it could still do for someone who'd actually appreciate it. I want it to go somewhere it will be appreciated. That's not anger. That's just finally being honest with myself. Patricia drew up the new will within the week. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in her office with 2 witnesses neither Preston nor anyone in his life would ever think to question, her paralegal, and, at my own quiet request, Denise herself, who I'd asked, the week prior, if she'd be willing to drive me to a personal appointment on her day off, no questions asked. She still had no idea, signing her name as a witness on that document, what exactly she was witnessing. I remember sitting in Patricia's office afterward, looking at my own signature on a document that would eventually upend everything. Preston believed he was about to inherit, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all in that moment. Not triumph, not vindication, just a quiet, settled peace. The particular piece of a woman who has finally, after 74 years, stopped trying to make people see her value and started simply living according to it instead. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected to find anywhere inside Magnolia Pines, let alone with someone who was, by every formal definition, simply doing her job. Denise started finding small ways to spend more time in my room than her actual rounds required, and I noticed, without ever pointing it out to her, that she never once did it the way some of the other staff performed kindness, loudly, in front of supervisors, in the particular manner of someone building a case for a good review. She did it quietly, almost privately, the way you do something because you actually want to, not because anyone's watching. She brought me real coffee one morning from a shop down the street, instead of the weak decaf the facility served. "Don't tell the kitchen staff," she said, setting it down with a small, conspiratorial smile. I told them I was just stepping out for air. She started bringing photos of Maya on her phone, showing me gymnastics meets, a school art project, a gap-toothed school picture from a few years back that Denise clearly still found impossibly endearing. I told her, in turn, about Preston as a boy. Not the version of him I'd been carrying around since the hearing, but the real one. The 8-year-old stacking inventory boxes into crooked towers, proud of work he hadn't quite gotten right. "He wasn't always like this," I told her one evening. "I think that's the part that's hardest to sit with. I don't know exactly when I lost him. I just know that somewhere along the way I did." "For what it's worth," Denise said carefully, "I don't think people usually get lost all at once. I think it's usually 100 small moments nobody stops to notice, until one day there's just a stranger standing where your kid used to be." I looked at her for a long moment. That's a very wise thing to say for someone who keeps insisting she's just a nurse. She laughed. "I'm a nurse who spent 12 years watching families fall apart in slow motion, Mrs. Whitfield. You pick up a few things." I want to be careful here, telling you about Denise, because I don't want to make her sound like a saint, or worse, like someone calculating, patiently performing decency in hopes of some reward she had no idea was coming. She wasn't either of those things. She was simply a tired, decent woman doing a hard job for low pay, who happened to have enough genuine warmth left in her, even after 12 years of watching people's worst moments up close, to spend 20 unpaid minutes a night with a lonely old woman who reminded her, she admitted once, of her own grandmother. There was one evening, about a month into my stay, that I think about often now. I'd had a difficult day. Preston had called that afternoon briefly, mostly to ask me to sign some routine paperwork related to the company's quarterly filings. Paperwork that I noticed was worded in a way that subtly expanded his authority a bit further than the guardianship arrangement technically required. I signed it anyway. I'd decided by then that letting him believe he was steadily consolidating control was far more useful to me than fighting him over scraps that no longer mattered. But the call left me unsettled in a way I hadn't expected, and Denise found me that evening sitting by my window. Not crying exactly, just very quiet, watching the last light fade over the courtyard. She didn't ask what was wrong right away. She just sat down across from me, the way she always did, and let the silence exist for a while before she finally spoke. "You know," she said, "for someone who built an entire company from nothing, you sure do let your son talk to you like you're nothing." I looked at her, a little startled by the directness of it. "I don't say that to be cruel," she added quickly. I've watched my own mother do something similar with my brother, spend her whole life building something, and then shrink herself smaller and smaller, just so he wouldn't have to feel small standing next to her. I always thought it was such a waste. Watching someone extraordinary apologize, basically, for being extraordinary. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I asked her something I'd been turning over privately for weeks, ever since the day she'd asked, almost offhand, whether Preston actually knew what I'd built. "Denise," I said, "if you found out someday that someone had left you something enormous, more than you could ever have imagined, more than you'd know what to do with at first, what's the first thing you'd actually do with it?" She laughed, clearly assuming it was a hypothetical, a tired woman's idle daydream. "Pay off my car," she said immediately. "Get Maya into a better school district. Maybe, if I'm feeling really wild, take one real vacation that doesn't involve sleeping in my car at a rest stop to save money on a hotel." "That's it?" I asked. "Nothing bigger?" She thought about it more seriously this time. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd want to do something that actually meant something. Not just spend it. I see so many people in here, Mrs. Whitfield, who spent their whole lives building something real, and their families just want to cash it out the second they're gone, like it was never anything more than a number. I think I'd want whatever I did with it to actually honor where it came from. Does that sound naive?" "No," I said quietly, feeling something settle firmly into place inside my chest. Something that had been uncertain until that exact moment, and now suddenly wasn't uncertain at all. "It sounds exactly right." She had no idea, smiling at me across that small room, completely unaware of the document sitting in Patricia Ford's office, with her own signature already on it as a witness, exactly how soon she was going to be asked to prove she'd meant every word of that answer. I won't dwell long on my final weeks. I think that's a mercy I can give myself, telling this story. Not every part of an ending needs to be lingered over to matter. What I'll say is this. I went peacefully, 4 months after I first arrived at Magnolia Pines, on a quiet Sunday morning, with the light coming gentle and gold through my window, the way it always did that time of year. Denise was the one who found me. She told Patricia, much later, that she'd known the moment she walked in, before she even checked, simply from the particular stillness of the room, and that the first thing she did, before calling anyone else, was sit down beside my bed for a few minutes, alone, because she said it didn't feel right to let the world rush in before she'd had a moment to just be sad. Preston came to handle the arrangements with the brisk, efficient grief of a man who'd already begun, somewhere in the back of his mind, cataloging everything that would now formally belong to him. He chose a tasteful funeral, an expensive casket, an obituary that described me accurately enough as a beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, and, almost as an afterthought, in the final line, as someone who had supported her late husband Robert in building Whitfield Building Supply into a regional success. Supported. Even in death, that was the word he reached for. The will reading took place 11 days after the funeral, in Patricia Ford's office, with Preston and Caroline seated comfortably on one side of the conference table, dressed in the particular shade of solemn that's really just patience wearing black. Patricia had also, at my explicit instruction left in writing months earlier, asked Denise to be present. A request that visibly confused Preston when he saw her walk in. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at Caroline before looking back at Patricia. "But why is? I'm sorry, what was your name again?" "Denise," she said quietly, taking a seat near the back of the room, clearly as uncertain as he was about why she'd been asked to attend at all. Patricia opened the folder in front of her, and I imagine, though I obviously wasn't there to see it myself, that the room had the particular hush of people about to hear something they assumed they already knew the shape of. "This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Robin Whitfield," Patricia began. "Executed and witnessed 4 months prior to her passing, superseding all previous wills and testamentary documents." I'm told Preston's posture shifted slightly at the word superseding, though he said nothing yet, still confident, still waiting for the language he expected to hear. Patricia read through the smaller provisions first. Modest, specific gifts to Marisol, my housekeeper of 19 years. A donation to the Children's Hospital that had hosted the gala where Preston met Caroline all those years ago. Education trusts, untouched and fully intact for both Wesley and Abigail, because whatever I felt about their parents, I had never once wanted my grandchildren to pay for choices that weren't theirs. Then Patricia reached the central provision, the one that made up the overwhelming majority of the estate. The controlling shares of Whitfield Building Supply. The properties, the investment accounts, the entirety of what amounted to just over $100 million. To Denise Marie Coleman, Patricia read, "In recognition of a kindness that asked for nothing in return, and in the sincere belief that she will honor what was built far better than those who only ever saw its value in dollars." The room went completely silent. I'm told Preston actually laughed, once, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, the kind of laugh that happens before a person's brain has fully caught up to what their ears just heard. That has to be a mistake," he said. "That's not, Patricia, that's not possible. She's a nurse. She's been in our lives for 4 months. It's not a mistake," Patricia said evenly. "The will is fully executed, properly witnessed, and your mother was independently evaluated by her own physician as fully competent at the time of signing. A fact I'd encourage you not to challenge in court, Preston. Given what that evaluation would require, revisiting about the circumstances of your guardianship petition." Denise, I'm told, hadn't moved from her seat near the back of the room. Caroline turned to stare at her with an expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief, and Denise simply looked back at her, pale, clearly still trying to process what had just been said about her own life. I don't understand," Denise finally said, her voice small in that large, expensive room. "I didn't know anything about this." "I swear to you, I had no idea." "I know," Patricia said gently, and then she opened a second envelope, sealed with my handwriting across the front, for Denise. "Eleanor left you a letter as well. She asked that I read part of it aloud, here in this room in front of everyone." The room went quiet again, differently this time. Not the brittle silence of shock, but something heavier, waiting. Patricia unfolded the letter and began to read, in my own words, the explanation I had been waiting 4 months to finally give. Patricia's voice was steady as she read, but I'm told even she paused once or twice, letting the words settle into the room before continuing. "Dear Denise, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you're sitting in a room full of people who are far more shocked than you have any right to be. I imagine you're confused right now. I imagine some part of you wants to say no, to refuse this, because it feels too large and too strange to accept from someone you only knew for 4 months. I want you to read the rest of this letter before you let yourself say no to anything. You once asked me, very gently, whether my son knew what I'd actually built. I told you no. I think that question sat with me longer than you realized, because it was the first time in years that anyone had asked about my life as though the answer actually mattered. Not as a kindness performed for an old woman in a nursing home, but as a real question, asked by someone who was genuinely curious. You sat with me on nights you didn't have to. You asked about Robert, about the lumberyard, about the recession and the contracts, and the 1,000 small decisions that built something larger than either of us. You never once asked what any of it was worth. Not once in 4 months. I want you to understand how rare that actually is, Denise, and how loudly it spoke to me. I am not leaving you this because I pity you, or because I'm trying to punish my son, though I understand why it may look that way to him. I am leaving it to you because you told me, on an ordinary evening, that if something like this ever happened to you, you'd want it to honor where it came from. I believe you. I believed you the moment you said it, before I'd even decided to test whether you meant it. Whitfield Building Supply employs 400 people, Denise. 400 families who depend on decisions being made by someone who understands that a business is not just a number on a balance sheet, but a responsibility to the people who show up every day to keep it running. I do not believe my son understands that. I'm not certain he ever will. I believe, with everything I have left to believe with, that you do. Take care of Maya first. Build whatever life the two of you deserve, the school district, the vacation, all of it, exactly as you said. But Denise, if any part of you is willing, I would be deeply grateful if you would also take care of the people who built this company alongside me. They deserve someone who sees them the way you saw me. You don't owe me anything for this. You already gave me something I hadn't felt in years before I met you. The simple, ordinary experience of being seen as a person, not a problem to be managed. Whatever you decide to do with the rest, that alone was worth more to me than every dollar attached to this letter. Thank you for the 20 minutes a night you didn't have to give me. With more gratitude than I know how to put into a single letter. Eleanor. The room stayed silent for a long moment after Patricia finished reading. I'm told Denise had her hand pressed over her mouth, tears running freely down her face, completely unself-conscious about it, in a way that, if I'd been able to witness it myself, would have told me everything I already believed about her. Preston, by contrast, sat rigid in his chair, his face working through something complicated. Not grief exactly, not even simple anger, but something closer to the particular humiliation of a man realizing in real time in front of his own wife that his mother had seen straight through him months before he'd ever filed that guardianship petition. "This is insane," he finally said, his voice climbing. She wasn't in her right mind. "This has to be challengeable. Patricia, you have to let us challenge this. You're welcome to retain separate counsel and explore that." Patricia said evenly, "Though I'd remind you again that any competency challenge would require revisiting the medical evaluation your mother passed with flying colors 4 months ago. The same evaluation, Preston, that directly contradicted the claims in your guardianship petition. I'm not sure that's a door you actually want opened in open court." Caroline's hand had gone very still on the table. I imagine, in that moment, she understood exactly what Patricia meant far faster than her husband did. Denise, still crying, finally found her voice. "I don't want to take anything that isn't mine," she said quietly, looking not at Preston, but at Patricia. "I never asked for any of this." "I know," Patricia said, with something gentle in her voice. "That's exactly why she wanted you to have it." Preston did, eventually, retain separate counsel. He spent nearly 8 months and what I'm told was a considerable sum trying to overturn the will, building a case around the same declining capacity, language he'd once used to have me committed to Magnolia Pines in the first place. It collapsed almost exactly the way Patricia predicted it would. The moment his attorneys tried to argue I'd been mentally unfit when I signed the new will, Patricia's team simply produced the independent competency evaluation I'd undergone the same week. The one that found me, in the doctor's own clinical language, fully oriented, exceptionally sharp, and entirely capable of managing complex financial decisions. The same evaluation directly undercut the entire foundation of his original guardianship petition. Preston's own legal strategy, in trying to claim I'd lost my mind months after the hearing, ended up proving, in open court, that I'd never lost it in the first place, which meant the guardianship he'd fought so hard to obtain had likely been built on exaggerated, even fabricated, claims from the start. He dropped the challenge before it ever reached a verdict. I understand Caroline was the one who finally convinced him to stop, not out of any change of heart, but because continuing risked exposing exactly how thin that original petition had been, and exposing that publicly would have cost them something Caroline valued even more than the money. The family's reputation in Savannah's social circles, the very circles she'd spent 15 years carefully cultivating. I think about Preston often, even now, in whatever way the dead are still permitted to think about the living. I don't believe he's a monster. I want to be clear about that one final time, because I think it would be easy to tell this story and let him become one in the retelling. I believe he's something sadder and far more common than a monster. A man who was given everything before he ever had to build anything, and who mistook the comfort of that inheritance for a right to whatever came next, simply because his name happened to be on the door. I think about that a great deal, actually, beyond just my own family. I think it's one of the quiet diseases running through so many families in this country right now. This idea that love and inheritance are the same transaction, that taking care of aging parents is a business arrangement to be managed efficiently, rather than a relationship to be honored patiently. I watched it happen to friends of mine in those last years. Parents quietly moved into facilities not because they needed the care, but because their presence had become inconvenient to someone else's calendar. Decisions made in conference rooms instead of kitchen tables. Love measured, increasingly, in square footage and thread counts, instead of in 20 minutes a night spent actually listening to someone. And on the other side of that same coin, I think about Denise. About an entire generation of people like her, working themselves past exhaustion for wages that don't match the weight of what they actually carry, showing up anyway, season after season, for people who are not their family, simply because some stubborn decency in them refuses to let a lonely person sit alone in a room. I don't think what I did was really about punishing my son. In the end, however it may have looked to him in that conference room, I think it was about a simple, overdue correction, about making sure that the people who actually show up in the ways that matter most are the ones who get remembered for it. I don't know what becomes of Whitfield Building Supply now, not fully. I'm telling you this story from somewhere past the part where I get to watch the ending unfold. But I know what I asked of Denise in that letter, and I know the kind of woman she'd already proven herself to be, long before she had any idea what was coming. I think, if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like the quiet one in your own family, the one who builds things and gets forgotten, the one who shows up and gets overlooked, I'd want you to know this. Being underestimated is not the same as being unseen. Somewhere, someone is always watching closely enough to understand exactly what you're worth. Sometimes it takes the people who love you longest the most time to notice it. Sometimes it's a stranger who notices first. Denise didn't touch most of it for almost a year. She told me, or rather, she told the story to a local reporter much later, after word of the will had quietly made its way through Savannah's business circles, and she finally agreed to one short interview just to set the record straight before the rumors got too far ahead of the truth, that the first thing she actually spent any of it on was Maya's gymnastics fees, paid a full year in advance, and a modest down payment on a small house with a real yard, the kind Maya had been asking for since she was old enough to ask for anything. The rest, she let sit, untouched, for months, while she met regularly with Patricia and with the company's senior leadership team, asking question after question, determined not to make a single decision until she actually understood what she'd been trusted with. She didn't take over Whitfield Building Supply the way Preston once imagined running it, from a corner office, at arm's length, with a title that outpaced the actual work. She started, instead, exactly the way I once had, on the floor of the original warehouse, learning names, learning the business from people who'd spent decades inside it, asking the kind of questions that told everyone immediately. She had no intention of simply cashing out what I'd spent 50 years building. Within 2 years, she'd kept every single one of the company's 400 employees, expanded the education trust I'd left for Wesley and Abigail, without anyone asking her to, and quietly funded a nursing scholarship program at the local community college. For women, she said in that one interview, who show up for people who aren't theirs to take care of, and don't get paid nearly enough for what that actually costs them. I think about that detail more than almost anything else in this whole story. She didn't build a monument to me. She built something useful. Something that would keep mattering long after either of our names stopped being the headline. Preston, as far as I understand it, eventually moved to Charleston with Caroline and the children, started a smaller consulting business that, by most accounts, struggles to find its footing. I don't know if he ever truly understood what happened, beyond the obvious financial sting of it. I hope, somewhere along the way, he did. I hope, somewhere along the way, he looked at his own children and decided to build something with them. Actual time, actual attention, instead of simply waiting for something to be handed to them one day. I think the real lesson in all of this was never really about money at all, however large the number sounds when people say it out loud. It was about a much simpler question. One I'd ask anyone listening to consider in their own life. Who actually shows up for you, without being asked, without expecting anything back? And just as importantly, who in your life have you stopped truly seeing, simply because they were always there? I spent most of my life being the quiet engine behind someone else's name on the door. It took losing almost everything I thought I had left to finally understand that being seen, really seen, by even one person was worth more than every dollar I'd ever helped that company earn. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to stay close. Hit subscribe if you're new here, and tell me in the comments, who's the quiet person in your own life that you think doesn't get seen enough? I read every single one, and I have a feeling this won't be the last story like this one I tell.